Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fielka. Today's May 14, 2024. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast, I'm Probably Wrong About Everything. It's an honor and a pleasure today to be here with Mary Mackey. Was that how you pronounce your last name?
Mackey.
I'm sorry,
Doesn't matter. Yeah.
Mary Mackey. Where are you calling in from, Mary?
I'm calling in from Sacramento, California today.
How cool is that? The first question is, what is the best thing for a human being?
What is the best thing for a human being? Warm, peaceful, and loving human relationships.
Oh my God, I love those adjectives. You're a wordsmith. Warm, peaceful, and loving relationships. Very good. What's your favorite form of information, how it comes into you?
I like all forms of information. I suppose my favorite form is talking to people. It really is. But I also, I read widely online. I read books still. I read Kindle books. I travel around and talk to people. I just talk to anybody anywhere. I like to talk to people. I'm interested in what they have to tell me. I like to hear their stories. So I get information from all sorts of sources.
That's beautiful. Let's go on reading for a second. Did you become a reader, one, because your parents told you to, two, they did it as an example, or three, on your own?
My parents read to me every night when I was a kid, starting when I was little. And I loved reading and I wanted to, I liked the pictures and I wanted to be able to read the words. And also, I actually started reading when we went on trips to see my grandmother because I learned to see the word eat on the signs by the roadway. So it was a bit like, a dog being trained to see food. So that's how I learned. That was my first word was eat. And and I loved words right away. They were my toys when I was a kid. Other kids, that was the favorite thing I had was words. And I made up stories for myself and things before I could read. Even told stories to my friends. Before I could read, I discovered that if I told stories to my friends and stopped at a good part, they'd give me candy to go on. So,
Nice.
yes, I was probably 4 or 5 then. I wasn't a particularly early reader. I learned to read in first grade, really.
Why do you think humans collect and gather information?
Well, that's a good question. Let me think about that a minute. Why do I think humans collect and gather information? Well, first of all, I mean, obviously it's for survival. You want to
Yeah.
know what's around you. You want to know what's creeping up on you. You want to know if you're going to step off a cliff, and you want to hear other people tell you, "Don't go down that path. It ends in a cliff." So
Yeah.
that's one kind of information. Another kind of information is you gather information so you understand that the world's bigger than yourself, and you understand what goes on inside of people, and what's there so that you relate to other people. And I think in whatever way you relate, preferably harmoniously, but you also gather information that way. You also gather information so your life is more comfortable, so
Yeah.
you're and also so you have a bigger sense of the world and what's happening. If and in our time, I think it's really important to gather information because information is now global, and what happens in one country affects another. So if there's a war going on somewhere, or if there's a flood or a drought or something, that may be very relevant to you. Now, that didn't used to be so true in the past. Information was more local. But I think, in some of my books, I mean, one of the major pieces of information people need to know is that there's going to be a periodic raid invasion of horse riding nomads coming off the steppes. So, they can prepare in any way they can, either, run, fight, hide. So I think, there's various reasons for gathering information. And I don't think one out, except for survival, I don't think one outdoes the other.
Yeah. Very good. And do you think this need or want to collect information is more innate or more invented?
I think it's innate.
Yeah.
Children love to collect information. You talk to children; they want to understand what words are. They want to know where things are. It's small amounts of information like where are they hiding the candy? Things like that. And people want information from the time they're very small. I think that's one of the traits of human beings. Animals too. Animals want information. If you take a cat and you let it loose in your house, it's going to look around to see if there's anything that eats cats. You know.
Yeah. Do thoughts create emotions?
They summon emotions. Do they create them? Um, yeah, I think they can, certainly. That's what literature does. in many ways. It creates an emotional kind of mirror in us for what's going on in other people. So I often have tried to imagine what history would be like if we didn't have any fiction or any personal journals or anything. We wouldn't have any idea what people were like in the Middle Ages. We wouldn't know what they were like in ancient Rome. We have, at least in the period of recorded history, we have some idea. We also have, stories from the past like Gilgamesh, and some stories handed down orally. There's still strong oral traditions, different places, and those things give us, they create emotions in us, and they say, oh, well, people in the Stone Age might have had very different ways, and in many ways felt different ways, but they were human. There's a basic human emotion. One thing I think that really speaks to that is I taught. I'm a retired professor from Cal State Sacramento. So I taught rhetoric and persuasion for 3 decades. And if you look at persuasion, the ways you persuade people emotionally have not changed since about 500 BC. And I doubt they changed before that. So I think there's a consistency in emotion, and that words do evoke them.
Really well put. And, you really get it, because it's me and you versus the wording on the question. So I'm all for changing the verbs and the nouns in
Yeah,
my questions, and you turned it into summons and really delve deep into explaining that. I really got what you were saying there. And I'm for stories, anecdotes, tangents. Really good. Mary, fill in the blank. I don't know what I think until I.
think it.
Well, Joan Didion says, I don't know what I think until I write it. And McLuhan says, I don't know what I think until I say it. I'm finding most people say, I don't know what I think until I do it or experience it.
That's interesting. I don't know what I think until the thought comes into my mind.
Yeah.
That's
It's good.
really, that really is the way I work.
Yeah.
That way.
Can humans think without language?
Can humans think without language? Yes, I think so, but we can't quite understand it. One of the things that I've thought a lot about creativity and where it comes from. And I think it comes from a pre-linguistic uh, wordless space. And of course, you can't very well ask other people to tell you about this since it's a wordless space. But I do think it's the space of mystical poetry and writing. And I think there's a way of being where you apprehend. I'm not sure you think in a linear sense, but you apprehend reality in a different way without words. Then I believe once you learn words, your thinking is limited in some ways and expanded in others. Limited in the fact that you no longer see the non-essential parts of everything, because you just can't do that. You'd be like a deer in the headlights. If you're looking at the rainbows in the puddles when you're crossing the street, you're going to get rubbed out by a truck. So, you can't do that. But you don't see that. And once you see a chair, you never see another chair, really, once you learn that word. So, and words are cultural. I speak some languages, and you can see the way words are divided up differently in different languages. So you don't see reality in the same possibility, finely grained, everything is relevant way. On the other hand, you can communicate with other people. You can live a sane, productive life in society, and you can also communicate some of the things you've learned to them, which you can't do without words very well.
Beautiful, Mary, because T.S. Eliot says, when I talk to you, I got to use words. And I'm like, no, you don't. You can use other things, but we know what he's saying. And
You know what he's
basically,
saying, yeah.
Chomsky says a language is not just words. It's a culture, a tradition, a
Yeah.
unification of
Mhm.
community, a whole history that creates what a community
Right.
is.
Yeah.
What do you do when language doesn't work? When language breaks down, what do you do?
What do you do when language breaks down? If you can't communicate, I've really been faced with this because I've been trying to write about a creative, where creative ideas come from, not as a how-to book, but where are they? And it is a place without words, and language does break down when you try to do that. I do think one of the best vehicles of language, when you can't really talk about it in a rational way because it doesn't have the categories, poetry works pretty well, because
Yeah.
poetry allows a lot of ambiguity. So a poem can say 6, 7, 10 things at the same time, whereas prose can't really do that. Prose is a much more logical string. And I think language can kind of dip in and out of different levels of perception, imagination, emotion, reality. And so I think poetry can kind of fold itself around that. And I think that's why you find mystical writing as mystical poetry. You find some mystical, prose, but not much. It's mostly poetry because that can sort of helps you contain the uncontainable.
Really good. Your observations of humans in general, are we more feeling beings or more thinking beings?
Depends on the human. People have different ways of processing information. I've been long wanting to write a poem called The Poet Talks to a Scientist, where you see the different ways they're perceiving reality. And, the poet is talking about, love and passion, and the scientist is talking about hormones. They're trying to talk about the same thing, but the one's doing it more through feeling words and one's doing it more through logical words. So I don't think you can make a blanket statement about that, but I believe it's pretty obvious that we're first feeling because animals feel. And, as far as we know, many animals don't have words. Apparently trees feel because of the way they communicate through the fungi and their roots and everything. So I think, probably emotions are primary in certain ways, but there may be a kind of perception that's a third kind of perception. I'm not sure. There may be a kind of perception that is neither emotional nor linguistic, and that may be a way of perceiving the world without either at some moment of where the world sort of stands still in a eternal sort of way. You read about this. And so I'm not willing to say either one is primary necessarily. I do think emotions probably do come first.
Yeah, most people say, are we more feeling or more head or more heart? They'll go, I think we're more feeling. They literally say, I think we're more feeling.
Yeah.
Bridget Bardot says, when I make love, I don't think. And I'm like, good luck. How do you turn your brain off? It's like people who
Right.
meditate.
Wait, you're not thinking about the roast beef that's burning in the oven? Bridget must have had a good time.
There's some good metaphors there. Roast beef burning in the oven. But but it's also a bumper sticker on a car in my street. It says, don't believe everything you think. And I go, well, you could say, don't believe everything you feel.
Right.
You
Right.
know, but
Exactly.
we invented these words, thinking and feeling. So we think we can separate them, but you can't really
No,
separate them.
not really.
The beauty you added is maybe there's this third, what did you call it?
A third level of perception, some kind
The
of
third
third
level.
way of perception would be better to say, because I'm not sure it's hierarchical. And I think,
Wait,
that I
say that again, Mary. Not level. What would you replace it with?
third, I don't know now, you've got it on record here, a third mode of perception, a third mode of
Mode.
perception, a
Mode.
third mode of perception that's not hierarchical, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
A third,
That's
a third way of perceiving.
yeah.
And I actually think I have I have a peculiar connection with this because I have run very, very high fevers in my life. And, I've run them up to 107, which is very high. You can only go to 107.3 for about 24 hours before you die. Most people go into convulsions about 106.5, but for some reason I don't. For about 8 times in my life, 6 to 8 times, I've run fevers at about 107. And, and I'm not trying to run this through any religion. I don't want you guys to buy me Rolls Royces. I just want to say that when you get to that state, about 105, up to 105, it's utterly miserable. You feel as bad as you've ever felt. You shake, your teeth chatter. Then about 100, so you start approaching 106, get to 106. And for me anyway, I can't speak for everybody. What happens is that I feel good. I feel fine. I'm not afraid of dying. Everybody else is running around saying you're dying, you're dying. And I say, it's okay. I crack jokes. I mean, I once talked in rhyme couplets for 4 hours under this. This is like not drug induced. This is just fever. But the way I've seen the world there, and it's been consistent, is very strange, which I've seen it. And this is what I've been trying to describe in creativity. I've seen it as a unity. It's all the same and it's all differentiated at the same time. It's simultaneously universal and differentiated. And it's very weird. And the only other place I have found it is like in the poetry of St. John of the Cross or Santa Teresa or something. But most people that have this experience, as far as I can tell, have filtered it through some kind of religious thing. I'm just looking at it. I don't know if it's endorphins. I don't know what it is. And then I didn't even realize till recently, people said, oh, you've had near-death experiences. And I said, oh, I guess so. But then I didn't really die. So I just came down. So so I've had a third mode of perception like that.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, it's very interesting. And I've always, it makes me a little less afraid of dying. I can't say entirely because you come off of it, but I've always, if you're given the great buffet of death, take fever, as far as I can tell. And, it's, comforting. It's sort of benign, which is really nice, in a way. And I have no idea why this is, none whatsoever. But I think it's been a way that I've seen reality slightly differently that's helped me be creative. Because
Yeah.
I can't go back into that state, but I can kind of edge toward it. And ideas just sort of come because they come, as people said, you think out of the box. And I said, there's a box.
That's like Cindy Sheehan. She protested the war on Bush's front lawn. And
Uh-huh.
she said, we're only preaching to the choir, and there ain't even a choir.
Right?
But like you're talking out of the box, and there ain't even a box.
There's not
Thank
even a box. There's no box,
God there's no box. Okay, here's two questions from Alan Turing in the 50s. One, is thinking a function of the soul?
Well, first of all, you have to believe in the soul, which I tend to think there is something that's, I'm not sure it's eternal. I'm not sure what it is. I think there's some kind of individual force in the body that's soul-like. Is thinking a force of the soul?
Function.
Function of the soul. Golly, no, I can't even answer that question. I think thinking, for me, I'm a pretty, as poets go, I'm really logical, and I tend to think of thinking as a function of the brain,
Yeah.
physically supported. Now, the soul may be somewhat independent of thinking, but I'm not sure thinking is a function of the soul. That's something I can't answer because I don't know enough about the soul.
Really appreciate it. I really welcome when people go, I don't know, or I can't answer that. I'm
Yeah.
totally open to that. The second Turing question is, can machines think?
They can simulate thinking. Can they actually think? That, I think, is the big question of our era right now. Can machines think? Machines can do a certain kind of logical stuff that we call thinking. Can they do? They don't seem to, at the moment at least, have a lot of common sense. They tend to hallucinate. Um, they tend to have some irrational aspects, which are surprising, given that people tend to think that they're very reliable. Can machines think? I think in many respects, machines can think if you think of thinking as logical. Can they think with emotional input and with the information of compassion that you get when you understand how other people feel? I don't think they're there yet. So I think they can partially think, but they don't have the vast capacity of human thinking, which involves taking into account and at the same time feeling what other people feel.
Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
Happiness.
Well, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, he says happiness doesn't tend to last, meaning does. What do you think of that?
I find meaning in happiness.
Yeah. Does the brain more detect consciousness or create it? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away and we're more so detecting it or more so creating it?
I think we're creating a certain kind of consciousness. I think there are possibly, and certainly traditionally, it's spoken of different kinds of consciousness. I think fever consciousness is different from what we would call, for me, I can only speak for myself because this is a very wordless individual state. I think there's a kind of consciousness that we don't recognize exactly as consciousness, whether it's immortal, whether it's eternal, whether it's outside of us or inside of us, I can't tell you. But I think what the brain mostly does is filter consciousness. It filters out things so we can function. If we don't have that, if we don't have that functioning brain, we can't act because there are too many things to perceive from our senses. And if you are sitting in a room and you watch every little variation of light in that room while somebody's talking to you, you're not going to remember what they said. There's just too much. You just freeze up. So I think the brain is mainly a filter.
Great word there. Thank you, Barry. What's faster, speed of light or speed of thought?
Speed of light. Just, I don't know. I'm guessing. I don't know. Somebody's probably tested that.
The poet Audre Lorde said, "You can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools." Yvonne Rainer responded and said, "You can if you expose the tools." What new tool do you suggest?
What master's house are we destroying? What kind of tool do I need?
Yeah, you put it in the context you want.
Oh, okay.
She's probably talking about white supremacy.
Right, white supremacy and racism. Yeah.
When Frank Zappa asked the question, "Who are the brain police?" he didn't say, "Oh, they're evil capitalist consumer," or "There's
Right,
some
right.
voice
Okay.
inside your
Master's house,
brain."
master's tool.
Yeah,
Let me think about the
yeah.
masters here.
And
Um,
here's the other thing, Mary, just to put it in context.
sure.
Just because I opened some of these questions with cute quotes, it doesn't mean you have to apply it. Really, the basic question is, what tool do you gravitate towards? Then you can apply it to the master's house and dismantling it if you want. So, again,
Yeah.
it's you put it in the context you want.
Oh, okay. I got it. Well, in my case, whether I be dismantling or building something, writing is what I do.
Yeah.
That's how I communicate with other people, both, well, except on an intimate friend basis. But in general, the tool I use is writing, and the parts of that tool, the different tools, are words.
Yeah.
And I'm very, very verbal. I can see things like an artist. I know because I've talked to artists and sculptors, painters and sculptors, but that I don't have the craft to do it. So the craft I have, the craft I've worked on my whole life, is the craft of using words to communicate things and the fine differences of things. And I love English because of that, because it does have the most words of any language, because it's a merging of Latin and the Anglo-Saxon and Norman French. And because of that, you have so many synonyms for things that you can get fine, very fine differentiations of emotions and thoughts. And I appreciate that in English. I'm glad to have been an English speaker.
You kind of already answered this, but what new toy do you suggest?
What new toy do I suggest? Uh, that's a good question. I don't know what new toy would I suggest? Well, we always have new words. I like those, but I don't think of, I've never thought of writing as a hobby. It's something I just do,
Yeah.
it's work, it's hobby, it's pleasure, it's joy. I guess a new toy of something that would bring us joy without hurting us would be great.
Yeah. That's really good, because you said words are toys earlier, and you
Yeah.
said another new toy would be a new word. So bingo. What do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
I'm worried about worrying. I'm trying not to, I don't want to worry when I go to bed at night. So I try not to worry. I do meditate, I just once again, without a lot of religious overtones. I've been doing that since 1975, once a day. And I find that very nice and calming. And usually I go to bed, if I'm worried about something, I just fret and it goes over and over in my mind. It depends. If something bad is happening personally, I tend to worry. Something bad's happening in the world, I tend to think about it. When I was a kid, during the Cold War, I used to try to stay awake to see the flash of light because I didn't want to miss it, because I was supposed to roll under the bed, but that didn't happen, obviously. I don't, when I'm a night worrier, it's when I'm upset about other things. And most of my time, I'm not worrying a whole lot before I go to sleep. I try to not watch television because I find that too much input makes me kind of crazy at night. I try not to use screens too much, and I try just to lie down and go to sleep.
You're smart. I love worry about worry, because at my mom's wake service, I said, "There's a lot of people in this room who worried that Dolores worried too much." And I basically, they all laugh, but I basically says, what's the difference between concern and worry? She
Yeah.
was concerned about us.
Yeah.
And if you complain and you gossip, you live longer. So, who knows? We just want to differentiate. It's like, worry's not good for you, but who knows?
Yeah, but sometimes you have to do it,
And it's probably healthy.
Yeah, it probably is. And also, worry is part of planning to make sure that you don't get caught by something, that's going to hurt you, or have a life that's going to make you miserable. So sometimes I think worry is the inability to figure out what decision you should be making. And, we all have a lot of that. But lots of times I try really hard not to worry about things I can't do anything about. Like, I'm very aware of climate change. I've been aware of it for many years. For Well, since about the late 1960s, when I saw the rainforests of Central America being turned into charcoal. It wasn't even called that at the time, but I've been concerned about it. But I don't sit up nights worrying about it. I don't
Yeah.
worry about atomic warfare. I don't worry about stuff because I can only do my little part. That's all I can do. I tend to worry more about personal things,
Yeah.
and that's where I pick my worries.
So McLuhan learned from Ezra Pound that artists are the antenna of the race. They're broadcasting and detecting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions. So we might learn how to cope with what we don't like about our inventions. So, Mary, I asked you the question Marshall probed his whole career. Why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
Well, I'd say for one reason, for money. The people that are inventing the inventions are making a lot of money on them, and it's to their benefit not to just explore things that are going to be disturbing about the inventions. Another thing is it's hard to see the future. I think one thing I'm very interested in the antenna part of that question, because I think that writers and artists and all creative people, and I will go in creative as physicists, and you don't have to stick to literature on this. You can be creative in cooking, you can be creative in anything. But I think that one thing that creative people do is, particularly in writing and art, is they come up with scenarios. And the scenarios, they imagine multiple scenarios for things. That's what science fiction does so well. You can find so many things predicted in science fiction, but if you look at all of science fiction, it's not all, it's just one or two things that seem in retrospect to be very prophetic. And I think that what writing does is, and in film too, I've actually seen this, and there are books about it. Film can kind of show you where a society is before the society knows it's there, because very popular, even B movies will tell you what's going on, in what people are interested in. And I often see things in movies and I think, ooh, we're not in very good shape. Things are not going to be good, and you can see it. And I can see that people won't go to the movies with me because I'll say at the beginning, oh, I know who did it, because when the credits roll, because I see narrative. And that's, it's sort of like the government CDC does things for, not CDC, the Defense Department does things, scenarios for all sorts of things, like alien invasions. I believe they have a scenario for all sorts of things, because you project these things. The difference is artists project them, writers project them. They understand, they see them, they imagine them. They imagine multiple things, then they put them in words for other people. And I think that artists really are the antennae for what's going on. I think if you look at writing, you can sometimes see in 19th century writing things that don't become clear until 2000. It's just amazing when you look back.
You described everything I study. Like Joyce sat in Paris in the 20s and listened to shortwave radio and wrote it all down. So he
Mhm.
basically invented the internet, Zoom, and chat box and disguised it as a book. And,
Right.
and, and then the other thing you touched on, and then he satirized the information overload that we're going to live in till the end
Yeah.
of time. And it's,
Yeah.
how do you process the information overload? How do you get over it?
Yeah, it's very hard. I mean, I just get so much email, so much stuff all the time, and too much stuff. It used to be if there was something horrible happening in your city, you found out about it,
Yeah,
or your village, I suppose. But I'll go
yeah.
city. But now, if something happens on the other side of the world that's horrible, you find out about it. I think it leads to somewhat compassion numbness for people. I think it's very hard for
Compassion,
people.
numbness.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I do. I think if you live in a closer, smaller community, and I have from time to time done that, you have a more immediate, you have more to spare. You have more emotional space to spare.
Yeah. That's the anthropologists, people like that say, we only need 150 people around you. That's the most. You don't need but anyways, what you said is all good, because it leads to this. You have ESP in a way because you anticipated. Do artists have moral obligation?
Do artists have moral obligations? Yeah, we all have moral obligations. I think we have moral obligations to be decent to each other, to support each other, to be compassionate with each other, to be kind to each other. We have strong moral obligations to keep the social contract with one another so that we can live harmoniously with each other. I think artists and all people have moral obligations, and artists, since they're communicators, have more. Now, I don't mean the moral obligation, the obligation to put some kind of judgment on other people. I mean, the moral obligation to be kind, compassionate, and supportive of other people as much as you can, and to bring them into the network of human society.
Yeah. Are you more afraid of new ideas or more afraid of old ideas?
I'm not afraid of ideas.
Yeah. Can you conjure up your earliest memory ever or one of them?
Let's see. Yeah. The best early memory I have is a fever memory. And I've written about this actually, but recently, but I've had it for, as long as I can remember. I'm almost 3 years old, not quite three. I'm about 2.5, maybe a little older. And I have a very high fever. And I'm lying in my bed, no, on a couch in the living room. It's a green couch. And there's a Coke bottle on the table. And and I'm very sick. And I can tell I don't know that my parents are frightened. I'm sure they are. And this is the first fever I can remember. And the Coke bottles sort of come up and make an aura around their heads. And then their faces sort of blow back and forth like that. And they sort of swell up. So I don't have a perception of distance that's kept. They get very big. And then outside the window, I'm in Boston, so it's January, all right? There's no leaves on the trees or anything. But the leaves on the trees suddenly come golden. I'm not saying here I'm seeing angels, okay? But I see little kids in the trees, and they're calling to me to come see them. And the leaves are all golden on the trees. And that's one of my very earliest memories. When I'm very young. And of course, obviously I lived. I'm actually very indebted to Western medicine. My dad was working in an army hospital and he had penicillin, and that wasn't generally available. So I was given penicillin, and penicillin killed everything bad in those days. So I survived.
Wow, what a description. Beautiful. Is memory more a curse or more a blessing?
Oh, it's a great blessing.
Yeah. Tell
It's
me
a great
some.
blessing because, you remember people you loved after they're gone, so they're not completely gone from you. You remember the beauty of the world when you're somewhere that's not beautiful. You remember peace when you're agitated. You remember some just moment. It may just be a casual moment when you sat with a cup of coffee and looked out the window and it was a spring day. And you have all that. Otherwise, you would be erased constantly and you wouldn't even know who you were.
Yeah. Tell me
I mean,
someone.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, and that's what happens, I believe. I don't know, of course, with people who have dementia.
Yeah.
They get erased. And,
Yeah.
then if you want to see if memory is a curse or a blessing, look at somebody who can't remember.
Yeah. Tell me someone within your immediate family, then outside your immediate family, just briefly, who had an impact on you, kind of like a role model. And what specifically was that impact?
My father. He was a very sweet man. He was very charitable. He was very kind. Uh, he was a doctor, OBGYN. He was friendly. He also liked to talk to people all the time. He always told me, that if people were mean to you, just remember they might have hemorrhoids and they might be upset. He was funny. He had a silly sense of humor, and he was just, read to me, and he was just a really kind person. Did a lot of work for free for people because he had a role model, which was he lived in a small Kentucky town when he was a boy, and he got very sick. His family was not rich, and a doctor came over from the next town for free to take care of him. I think he had malaria. There was malaria in the Ohio Valley in 1920s when he was there, and the doctor took care of him for free and took care of him, made him want to be a doctor. He passed that tale on to me, and then that idea of just doing more than you need to for people if you can. And I don't always come up to that, but he was just a pleasure his whole life.
What a sweet, sweet story. And then, Mary, outside your immediate family, same question.
Yeah, when I went to college, I was an English major, but I went to a college that was pretty discriminatory against women. I couldn't use the undergraduate library because women weren't allowed in it. I couldn't go to dinner with famous people, although the university was quite famous because women, quote, brought down the tone of conversation. So there was a lot of sexism and discrimination. But I was writing an honors thesis on Charles Dickens to get honors, and I met a professor at dinner in one of my dorms named Richard Evans Schultes, who was a biologist, but he loved Dickens. And we talked together about Dickens, and he invited me to Dickens' 150th birthday party in the Old North Church in Boston. And I was the only female there. I was very young. All the guys were nice to me. They wouldn't let me drink, of course, because I wasn't of age yet. And then Professor Schultes hired me to just be a gopher for him, I just sat in the Ethnobotanical Museum. He kind of, Schultes invented the concept, I believe, the field of botany, which is how people use plants. And there were pictures of him on the wall. He was very proper looking, more suit, very Bostonian, but there were pictures of him on the wall, in shorts with gourds up his nose, having stuff blown into his nose by guys, indigenous people and everything. And he just gave me a passion for the tropics. And so although as an English major, I became very interested in botany. I audited his courses. And as soon as I could, I ended up in the tropics as once again, an unpaid, field assistant in biology, and lived in the jungle. And I've gone back to Latin America many times. I love it. I love Spanish and Portuguese and people, and I love the jungle. And I've spent a lot of time in the Amazon and in the Central American jungles. And it was just a major inspiration in my life and heavily influenced my poetry and my writing.
Did your parents raise you a particular religion?
We were Methodists, but not very firm Methodists. I actually quit the Methodist Church when I was 12 because I was becoming very interested in civil rights, and there were no Black people in our church. And we had a mission in Korea, but there were no Black people in the church. And so I said to my mother, "Why aren't there Black people in our church?" And there was no particular answer for this, except that we lived in a community and have Black people in the church in Indianapolis. And so I said, I must have been terrible to raise. I said, "The Methodist Church is a whitened sepulcher, painting and carvings without and bones and rot within, and I'm not going back." And so I didn't go back. And my mother got me up every Sunday in the morning. She said, "If you're not going to church, you can't sleep in." And I didn't. But I'd actually read the Bible, and it looked to me like they weren't doing what it said you were supposed to do.
Hello. Mary, do you pray?
Yes, I do.
If God exists, what would you like God to say to you after you die?
Good job, Mary. Thanks.
Do evil people exist, or does evil use people as a vehicle?
Evil people exist. We could call them by other names, but people do evil. They do very bad things. That doesn't mean they can't be forgiven. That doesn't mean they can't change, but that does mean they have to be resisted in some way or another, preferably nonviolently. But yeah, I think there's evil in the world. People, you could call it mistakes, call it what you want, but horrible things have been done to people by other people that are a waste of everybody, and whether or not, that, and it, when you murder or you kill one person, it's like throwing a stone in water. The grief comes out in circles and circles and circles. So you do so much more harm than deprive someone of life who's no longer around to suffer. You make many, many more people suffer. And I think that propagation of suffering is something that people do, whether they do it by accident, whether they do it intentionally, they do it. And that's something we all need to try not to do.
Really, the hidden question is, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? And I'll set it up with a few thoughts. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Coppola stole from the mob and the samurai, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. JFK said, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. And Fellini says, I need an enemy. So it's a lot of thoughts. Basic question is, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you respond to Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
Well, I think that's a variation on something that I've learned online, which is don't feed the enemy monster. In other words, if you have an enemy, or somebody's being horrible, don't feed them, don't give them, don't talk, don't engage them in argument. They're not, if they're not persuadable, don't engage them in argument, don't feed them, don't give them stuff to, react against that way, go back from them. It depends what they're doing, of course. If they're really doing something to you personally, you need to get away from them. If they're doing something that's really unpleasant that you don't like, get away from them. You can forgive them and I think the JFK one I liked best. Forgive them, but don't forget their name. You see if you can forgive them, because I think in forgiving your enemies, you remove a lot of stress and pain from yourself. And your enemy may not care whether or not they're forgiven, but you will feel better about it, and you will not be under the power of your anger and your anger with them. But they're different kinds of enemies. It depends what exactly they're up to. How you can deal with them. I do believe in forgiving your enemies.
Yeah.
I even believe in praying for your enemies. I believe, but I don't believe in staying with people who hurt you, and I don't believe in not restraining people who are doing evil.
Yeah, it reminds me, Mark Twain said, forgiveness is the smell the flower releases when the foot steps on it.
That's good. That's funny. And I don't know if you looked at my bio or something, but I'm a distant relative of Mark Twain. And I was
Hello, I did. How cool is that?
How cool is that? And that's one of some of the things my parents read to me when I was little. They read Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn and, Mark Twain. And that made me feel like, well, I could be a writer. Somebody in my family was, a long, long time ago. It's not a direct descendant, it's like some kind of distant cousin, but I actually looked up the genealogical charts, and my family in Kentucky evidently had a bag of letters from Missouri from the Clemens, but it burned when the barn got hit by lightning. So we don't have them, which is too bad. I'm sure they'd be great to read.
Yeah. Well, Nassim Taleb said, games were created to give non-heroes the illusion of winning. In real life, we don't know who wins or loses, but we can tell who a hero is.
Mm-hmm.
Gregory Bateson said, when the criminal gets caught, does he go, whoa, my criminal skills weren't up to snuff that day? Or does he go, I did something morally and socially wrong? So you can go wherever you want with the prompts, but the basic question is, does punishment work?
Does punishment work? Restraint works. I don't want mass killers out there roaming around society. I don't want psychopaths, doing things. I think these people need to be restrained and kept out of, kept where they can't do harm. I do believe that. It doesn't have to be. Does physical punishment work? Does killing people work? I don't think so. I always think with the death penalty personally that, let's say, I say to my friends who say, oh, they should, I have friends who believe on religious grounds in the death penalty. And I say, well, don't you want to give them time to repent? Put them in prison. And actually, I think, I think evil needs to be restrained. That's why I'm not a complete pacifist. I believe in not attacking, but I do believe in defense, real defense, not imaginary defense, far away for imaginary things. But if you're attacked, you defend yourself. And if somebody is really evil and pathological and continues to perform evil acts, they need to be restrained. I don't think you should flog people. I don't think you should do things like that. But I do think, yes, people need to be restrained. And if that's punishment, that's the punishment they need.
Really quick, if Trump gets thrown in jail, he cannot run for president. He writes a book and says, I'm sorry. Would you forgive him?
I'd forgive him anyway.
Yeah. Beautiful. James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin about 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, this is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree? Years later, Faulkner said, sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism. Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
Well, because if we just lived life, I'm thinking about this. If we just live life without plays or movies or literature, well, first of all, it's entertaining and distracting. Let's just start at the basics. Entertaining and distracting. People have a lot of grief in their life. They have a lot of trouble. And sometimes they need to just check out and have a comedy or something that makes them feel better, that doesn't hurt them, that they can laugh with other people. If you look at the movies from the 30s, for example, the movies that are popular are, white telephone movies, they used to call them. Movies that just, they don't necessarily have redeeming social importance. Sometimes people just need distraction. On the other hand, another reason we recreate things is that not everybody can be in nature all the time. So particularly with the development of cities, we can't, a lot of people, if they have a park, they're lucky to be able to go to. Another reason is that when you have, once again, films and literature and you recreate things, one thing you're doing here is recreating them with the emotional overtones so that you can communicate those to other people. So, you can live inside other cultures, other people, other races, other bodies in literature as well as people can imagine them, and it broadens your perspective toward other people, I believe.
Really good, Mary. Let's go into your callings. I mean, you've done a lot. You're a poet, an educator, a fiction writer, and so much more. Let's talk about the tipping points, and you sort of mentioned it. Where you're studying English lit in college, where you go, oh, I can write. Where's that tipping point to say, I can write poetry? You're reading it. Where's that? You're like, I can do this, and that's my calling.
Well, I didn't know, I wouldn't have called it a calling, but I started writing poetry really young. I mean, it's not in college. I started writing, well, before I could read and write, once again, I made up songs and poems and things that rhymed. I liked rhyme, and I can always still remember everything that rhymes. It was just sort of like I was born on my feet, doing stuff like that. I made up poems in French. I knew Frere Jacques, but I didn't know French, and I didn't know a language had to be understood by everybody else, so I made up fake French, when I was very little. So I started writing poetry. Well, I think seriously when I was about 11. And I started, trying to, I was sort of imitative, but I was seeing the world differently. And I wrote some poems about the way the world looked. I wrote a little book of poetry. It's now with my papers. It's not great poetry. It's not terrible poetry, but that's 11, 12 is when I really started writing poetry. And I didn't do it because I thought, I want a poet, I want a career. I did it because I liked writing. I mean, I never thought of poetry as a career. I wanted to get published, of course. We all want to get read and heard and thought of, but that wasn't my main aim. My main aim was I loved writing, and it made me happy. I'd sit there and write, and, I'd put words together, and it was a lot of fun to do, I've often asked my students, because I taught creative writing for so long, I'll ask them, why do you write? Why are you writing? And some of them will say, oh, I want to get famous, and some will say, oh, I want to be like, I don't know, Edna St. Vincent Millay, pick anybody, I want to be like that, or I want to get laid, because that by the way is a mistake. That's not going to happen if you're a poet. But anyway, all this kind of stuff. They say this stuff, but the people that really have the most talent frequently say, I have no idea why I write. I can't stop. I've tried, but I can't stop. If I were in Antarctica, I'd write for penguins. They just can't tell you why they write. And I can't really tell you why I write, except that it's fun for me. I enjoy it. It's a great pleasure. It's very absorbing. And I just love putting things together and speaking to other people in that way.
Yeah, let's stay in poetry now, because we can go into education, screenwriting, and other things. But I'd love you sort of entered this poetry thing. And because Rex Roth said, the function of poetry is to woo your lover and subvert the bourgeois.
I can deal with that, yeah.
But a screenwriting teacher told me great art is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick says the opposite. Great art is when you clearly not see the intention of the maker. What role does intention play in your creative process when you're writing a poem?
When I'm writing a poem. Okay. I also write novels, and it's very different, but I'll go with poetry here.
Let's go. Let's stay on poetry, and then we'll go into novels. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. When I'm writing a poem, what is my intention? It's not logically describable at the begining. It becomes quite logical. But when I'm getting a creative idea, a sentence will come into my mind. I'll see an image. I might see, I don't know, it could be anything. It could be an ant on a leaf. It could be a sunset, something trite. It could be something strange. It could just be a memory. And it's very diffuse. Sometimes I don't just write the poems off the top of my head, but what I will do is I'll sit down, and thank you, Mr. Joyce, I will do stream of consciousness writing. I always write my poetry by hand, and I'll just write out stuff. Now, lately, I've been dictating it into my phone as I walk along. It's similar to writing it that way. And what I end up is sort of a lot of word salad garbage, basically. But some of it's good. And so I'm ruthless at cutting. And so I'll cut out the good parts. I'll see if I can put it together, and I'll get something that sort of looks like a poem. And I do a lot of revision. And at that point, logic kicks in. And I will look for better words. I will try to think of different images. I will try to make it less expectable. I sort of think in metaphor. So I'll look for the best metaphors for things. I do think in metaphor. I don't sort of think in metaphor. I often think in metaphors. And so I'll put them together. So there's a great deal of craft. So there's inspiration, I guess you'd call it. There's some kind of thing that happens in my mind where I enter a sort of space where ideas appear to me, maybe influenced by fever, maybe not, I'm not sure. And then I'll, write them down as fast as I can, whatever. And then I'll cull and cull and cull and cut and cut and cut. And I have one poem that's my best example. It was 4 pages long. It ended up being, I think, 2 lines. And the 2 lines are, let's see, you don't have to get good at dying. You only do it once. And that
Oh my God. So the whole poem went whoop.
4 lines down to that.
What's the name of that poem?
Good question. I don't remember. I could look it up for you right now.
All right, that's all right. I love it. I love it. Yeah, because you brought up Joyce there. I follow Joyce's wise advice. Remember to forget.
Yeah.
But let's say there's so many you're evoking so many other questions, but I want to sort of stay on line here for a second. Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. How much are you thinking of your reader when you're writing your poem?
In the initial part of it, the kind of stream of consciousness, whatever it is, the creative part where the ideas come out of nowhere, sort of, but sort of not out of nowhere, which is like what I've been trying to describe in, this very little book I've just written on creativity. I don't think of my audience, but as soon as I start actually crafting a poem, I think of audience. I think audience is essential in writing, because if you don't know who you're talking to or how you're talking to them, you're not going to communicate. So I think strongly about a general audience. I don't try to think about a specific audience, but I'm not writing for the happy few, as Stendhal said. I am writing for. I like to do layering. I like to make my stuff, my poems, even and my novels, very accessible to people. Yet at the same time, if you have a different kind of education or different language or a different way of approaching things or come from a different country or understand certain languages, you'll see different levels in the poetry and in the novels. So my things are highly leveled in that way. So I think a lot about that, and I try to make that happen for people.
Wow. So McLuhan says everything we invent extends some humanness. Like knife and fork extends our teeth, the shutter in a camera or a projector extends our eyelid, and even non-tangible, say a religion or philosophy, might extend consciousness. What does the writing utensil extend for you? And you said you wrote with a pen, but it could be a pen or the keyboard. What humanness does it extend?
The humanness of communication, greater understanding, closeness to other people, a kind of verbal embrace that goes far, far beyond you and includes other people in it. I think that would be the best way to think of it.
Couple other quotes about art. I'm curious your reaction. Mike Kelly said, art is making your problems other people's problems.
Well, sometimes it can be. That's usually not my focus on that. I don't
Yeah.
necessarily make my I write for several reasons. I write to entertain people because I
Yeah.
like to amuse people, and entertain people. I've always enjoyed doing that. When I was a little girl, once again, I said my dad was in the army for a little while. I was till I was about 3.5. I was an army brat, going around. And this was after World War II. He was a doctor. He wasn't overseas. And there were all these, they'd show movies for the enlisted men, who were in the hospital. Many of them were wounded and all that stuff. And I was a little girl, and they'd have me before the movies. I'd dance for them. They'd have me out there because these guys didn't have kids yet. They hadn't come out of the army. I liked it. I liked all the guys. I danced for them. They were very sweet to me and everything. So I always like to communicate. I like to be out there. I like to be, that's kind of fun for me in that way. Do I make my problems other people's problems? I suppose sometimes I talk about my problems. I talk about darker things and things, but you can take them or leave them. I'm not trying to make them your problems, But I think sometimes when you talk about, problems, griefs, things that have happened to you, which are serious, then you allow other people to feel companionship with you in that way. Some people, find that useful. They say, "Oh, I'm not the only person that has felt that way," and I think that's important. But mainly, I can't tell you exactly why I write, because I write such a great diversity of things, and some of them are problems, and some of them are funny. I've written funny novels. I've written funny poems. I have a funny poem called "Elle Tells All," which is Leda from Leda and the Swan. That
Yeah.
story where she talks about how Zeus really wasn't all that good. There's one thing that, like, we argued. I called him a stuffed pillow. He said he was going to migrate. Things like that. So I do humor. I also do very serious poetry and very serious work, and I just have a very wide range in what I do.
Beautiful, Mary. Here's the poet Fanny Howe. The
Mhm.
point of art is to show people that life is worth living by showing that it isn't.
Wow, that's interesting. No, I don't. I don't think I agree with that one.
No.
Uh, I don't think you show people life is, I think if you're showing people that life is very difficult, you're not showing them it's not worth living. I think life is worth living. I think it's a gift.
Yeah.
I think that's to remember. I think one problem you have, and I've been through some hard times. I'm not just a little Miss Cheery all the time here. And I think that one thing that you have to really hang on to when things are bad is that time is going to be distorted for you. And it's going to seem like forever. And when you're depressed, it's going to seem like it will never end. And if you can put up a sign or remember somehow that time will start again and that time will go on, it's big. It's a big help. And I think being trapped in that idea that life is not worth living leads to suicide.
Really good. Yeah. And so a couple others, just staying on poetry, your motives. You're really a good listener. I appreciate this. And this is Milan Kundera in The Unbearable Likeness of Being. This is why I love writing, because the character that I'm writing about can go further than I can.
Oh yeah, that's great. I like that, and I like that book. That's a good book.
Yeah.
Um, Yes, further than I can. The character that I'm writing about can go back into Neolithic Europe. The character I'm writing about can be in Tsarist Russia doing ballet. I can
Yeah.
have many, many experiences, many, many voyages I can traverse, many places and beings I can enter, sort of like being reincarnated, in Sacramento. I can, I can do so many other things, and I enjoy it so much. And I do a research. I do some research for my poetry, a lot of research for my novels, and every time I do it, I just feel sort of expanded. Like I don't know that I'm accurately persuading, you know, depicting things that happen in prehistory, but I do my best to do that, and it gives me a feeling of living there for a while. And I miss my characters when I finish a novel. I like friends that I have to now move on from, like moving to a new town.
Yeah. And here's the poet critic, or she was a poet critic,
Mm.
Helen Vendler. She just passed away.
Hmm.
The end of her obit in the New York Times. I write to explain things to myself.
Oh yeah, I would completely agree with that. Yeah, I write to make sense of the world to myself, and
Yeah.
maybe help make a little sense to other people, but partly I do. Yeah, that helps you kind of figure out how the world works. Because when you're forced to enter other cultures, even in imagination, I also have traveled a lot, but even in imagination, when you enter other cultures, yeah, it helps you understand how the world works. Also, it really helps you understand that the world does not work in the same way in different places in different people. You get a sense of the fact that it's not just, I think it's George Eliot who said that we all think of ourselves as a little candle on a scratch table, and the light makes all the circles seem to come toward us. And so we look at the center, but actually the scratches go all different ways, and they're all different candles. And I like to think I'm not just the little candle with everything surrounding me. I'm just, I'm on the table with lots of other candles where the scratches go different directions. And I think writing helps me understand that.
Yeah, that was good. Bertolt Brecht asked Charles Lawton, why do you act? Why are you an actor? And he said, because people don't know what they are like, and I think I can show them. Any thoughts on that? Being a poet, like, it goes along with Igor Stravinsky says most people don't know what they like what they know.
Mm.
So it's sort of this thing about knowing and not knowing, So, Lawton saying, I can show them. Any thoughts on that?
I could show them other things. I think people often know what they like, but they don't know all the things they could like. And so I think that sometimes when I'm writing poetry, screenplays, novels and stuff, I can show people other things they much like. I love to tell people things. I'm full of fun facts, probably, So I like to say, hey, you know this or you know that, or hey, this is really interesting. I'm just a rag bag of this stuff. And I like it and I have a reasonably good memory. So I like to tell people something and people often find it interesting. I've just always been interested in ideas and, strange little things like I mean, most people know this now, but like the trees that actually communicate with one another, and support sick trees and stuff. And you find out that stuff and you think, I bet other people would be interested in that too. So I guess in some ways I was a born teacher,
Yeah.
And my brother says that to me. He says I was always teaching. I'm the oldest of three. He's 5 years younger. He said I was always telling him stuff when he was a kid.
You were a born teacher. That's beautiful. Because if we met at a cocktail party and we just started talking in the corner, I like go to the Bob Dylan line he learned from the Bible. Don't ever tell anyone everything you know. And it was like, Mary, I want to tell you everything I know, and I want you to tell me everything you know, and we could just sit here and talk forever.
Get me out of here now. Right? You have to listen. You can't just tell people stuff.
Right. Listening is a very important part of
Right.
it.
And you have to ask. I mean, I'm interested in asking questions and have people tell me about them and maybe tell them myself, tell them about me. But I'm really more interested in hearing about what they have to say about themselves because I know what I have to say about myself. So.
Yeah. But it goes into this word taste then. My friend says for music, the 3 T's are technique, theory, and taste. So you learn how to play the instrument, you learn the structure, and then how does one acquire taste? Like, how did you acquire the taste to veer towards the poets that you like?
Yeah, I've always read a great deal. I always had a library card as soon as I could. As I said, my parents read to me. So I just discovered people, I just would roam around and pick up books. I wrote a whole novel once by picking up a book in a library when I should have been grading papers. I picked up a book called History Starts at Sumer, and I said, wow, no, it doesn't. It starts before Sumer. And so I wrote about goddess worshiping cultures pre-Sumerian called The Last Warrior Queen. It was one of my first early novels, not my first novel. And I just randomly pick up things, random facts, random books. But also I ended up having a very good education. I went to a good public school. Through most of my education, grade school and mostly high school, I went to a really good university where I got a superb education, and I was given the chance to know and come in contact with people. And also I learned different languages, and I was able to come in contact through literature, through the literature. I mean, I have a degree, a PhD in comparative literature. So I wrote a dissertation on the Darwinian Revolution, the influence of the Darwinian Revolution on the 19th century novel in French, English, Spanish, and Russian. And so I was able to read literature in all those languages. And they took me to poetry, and it took me to novels, and it took me to all sorts of things that helped me, influenced me a lot, and showed me where my favorites were. And I think, there's nothing like, if you can read a poet. I learned Spanish to read St. John of the Cross. That's why I learned it. And if you can read poetry in its own language, it can be really good with a good translator, but it blossoms in a way in the language itself, and it shows you a different world. And so I found writers I really loved in other languages and other cultures, and also in languages I can't read that have been well translated.
Yeah. Leo Bersani studied Mallarmé's poetry, The Symbolist. He said the very crises which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition. Now, there's a lot of words there I'm always fiddling with, but you get the gist of it. What do you think of that? Because I'm always trying to figure out what Leo meant there. The very crises which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition.
Well, the symbolists are really big about torturing themselves about the blank page, the blank page, how they can't write, and I don't have a crisis. Well, I've had writer's block. When I was writing my doctoral dissertation, I spent 3 years unable to write. It's like my poetry or anything else. It's like my mind went hyperlogical, and I couldn't get in touch with anything not logical. So, I mean, I've been there in that way. But in general, I haven't had a crisis in writing, not much of writer's block, because somehow ideas just come out of nowhere. And I think it's partly because of my very strange relationship with creative ideas and fever. And, maybe not fever. I don't know what it is. It might have been inborn. I think the crisis of writing, I don't find writing a crisis. I mean, writing's hardly ever a crisis. I mean, if you're writing directions on how to get out of a building that's on fire, that's a crisis. But there's almost no writing there's almost no crisis in writing, no time frame on it. So I don't see writing as a crisis. There are other things. I see a crisis as an earthquake, but not writing. Now, if you want to leave a note, even the note that says, I didn't get crushed under the house, that you leave on your house after the earthquake, that's not a crisis. A crisis is people who are under a collapsed freeway and need to be pulled out.
Yeah. What's the function of poetry?
What's the function of poetry? Well, let's see. One function is it entertains the poet. What's the function of poetry? I think it does preserve, in some ways, a wider and more flexible emotional state of emotions. It also shows you the way words can sing in your mind, and they're like song. I've written song lyrics. What's the function of poetry? Is poetry essential to society? I think fiction and poetry are essential, as I've said, probably repeated here many times, because they plumb a kind of emotional depths that nonfiction doesn't tend to do.
Yeah, really good. And talking about song lyrics, Leonard Cohen says, if you don't put yourself at risk when you're putting on a concert, people know that. So what role does risk play in your creative process?
Well, the risk mostly comes afterwards, I'd say, because I think you can have a big influence in poetry when you read it, particularly when you read it live. It happens streaming, but reading it live is more so. When you read it live, you're a person up there, and the emotion and the body language and all of those things that you really can't see so well on Zoom, or you can't really see if you read it on the page, really come through. And so it's a little scary to do that, but at the same time, it's immensely rewarding in the fact that there's a kind of communication you get when you read live to a live audience, where you can feel the audience, you can feel them reacting, you can feel whether they're bored or whether they're there or whether they're not there or whether they're responding. And that in itself kind of feeds the way you read the poetry to them. So risk for me is more in-person things than it is writing itself. I don't feel that I'm risking much when I write. I mean, I had a day job, no heavy lifting, I was a professor. I did that on purpose. I looked at all the writers. I read a lot of biography of writers, and so many of them tried to live by their writing, and so many of them ended up in a garret or ended up in terrible poverty. And I'm very practical. I'm Midwestern, and I thought, and I was female, and I thought, I'm going to have a day job so I have a certain amount of independence. I loved teaching. I thought I could be, at that point, I could be a secretary, a nurse, or a teacher. And I thought, well, I have to be a teacher. And I can't teach high school because I'm too short to keep discipline. So I'll try to teach college, and I did. I was lucky for many, many ways. And I didn't feel a crisis in writing. I could have been I love teaching. I could have been perfectly happy teaching my whole life, except that, and I've probably written for myself. So writing's not a crisis for me. It's not like that. It's more of joy. It's fun for me.
Yeah. You touched on this. Gary Snyder said, my task as a poet entails the work of seeing the world without language and then bringing that seeing into language.
Perfectly said.
Yeah.
Great Gary Snyder quote. I couldn't agree more. And I think I've talked about that quite a bit. But yes, I see things that are not at the moment in our language, in our culture, in our way. I don't think of it that way, but that's what happens. I hear, I look. I can look at anything very intently and it will become something slightly different when I look at it. I mean, and I said, I've done this with my students. It's a little eerie, but if you look at your own thumb long enough, or your hand particularly, with absolute focus, hyper focus, which is one of the ways I work for creativity. If you look at your hand long enough, it will become indistinct. You will never believe you've ever seen it before. It's really bizarre. And I mean, at least this works for most people. I can't say for everybody. And it's like, because you're looking at it as something new. You're not just saying, oh, that's my hand. I've always had it. And, I'd say, look, exactly about 20 minutes, it starts looking like a starfish. It becomes a metaphor. I believe metaphor is not sprinkled into poetry and writing like oregano is sprinkled into a salad. I think metaphor is part of everything, and everything has some correlation that if you look at it long enough, you will see metaphorically it looks like something else.
Yeah. That's huge. McLuhan studying him has taught me that all language is metaphorical. In fact, I'm for having and knowing cute quotes and aphorisms, but he taught me rework them and reinvent them. You have an epiphany from an aphorism, but then how can you take it farther? So he took Robert Browning's our reach should exceed our grasp, or what is heaven for? And he said, our reach should exceed our grasp, or what is a metaphor?
I like that.
I knew I could get you to laugh, Mary. You are so fun. So here is Marshall McLuhan in 57. It's misleading to suppose there's any basic difference between education and entertainment. This distinction merely relieves people the responsibility of looking into the matter. It's like setting up the distinction between didactic and lyric poetry on the ground that one teaches and the other one pleases. However, it's always been true that whatever pleases teaches more effectively.
Absolutely. And that's true when you're actually in a classroom. If you can be, you can teach in ways that are there, you don't just drone on. You don't just, stand up there to be your own ego and just talking. If you can talk to people actually and teach them and even be funny sometimes and teaching is performance, but it's not a fake performance. It's understanding your audience, which is always the clue for writing. It's the clue for teaching. It's a clue for communication, that so yeah.
Yeah, that was beautiful. And a friend or one person I interviewed last week, he says, whatever displeases can teach me too. But it's you go into this like you become what you behold, like Blake. I love your positiveness. Utah Phillips said, anarchy is making rules for yourself and not other people. Who's entitled to make the rules?
That's a very good question. I pondered that a lot when I was writing my novels because I was writing, well, I wrote 3 novels, The Year the Horses Came, The Horses at the Gate, and The Fires of Spring, about the goddess worshiping cultures of Neolithic Europe. And I looked at the kind of setup, I based it on a lot of archaeology and research. I do a lot of research and on artifacts found, and we don't have written history of it, but it looks like it was a parallel. These are small villages. They don't have the horse yet. They don't have, there's a big invasion that comes about this time from horse riding nomads who reintroduced the horse from the steppes of Europe. But before that, you look at these societies and they look like they're lateral. They look like they're partnership societies. They look like you kind of think of a New England, town council or something. So who has the right to make the rules? Well, I think you need to get a lot of people together to make the rules. I don't think one person has the right to make the rules for everybody else. I don't think that's effective. I don't think it's fair. And I think it leads to abuse. So I think that the rules need to be made. Somebody has to direct things. You can't have everybody going out and doing everything at the same time. But the basic rules, the laws need to be an artwork of the community.
Beautiful, because I'm just finishing up an essay, Can Art Stop War? And I've studied Maria Gimbutas, and I know you have, and
Oh
you're
yeah,
just saying partnership, Rian Eisler, Chelsea, and the Blade.
yeah.
And, it's sort of sad, but when I ask people, are we more hardwired for war and fighting or more hardwired for cooperation? What do you think they say?
I think they say we're more hardwired for war because that's the Darwinian Western view. However, one reason I wrote my novels was that I believe that we're about 10,000 years when we were not having genocidal warfare of any kind. Now, I'm not saying people didn't fight each other. I'm not saying they didn't murder each other. I'm just saying we didn't have genocidal organized warfare. We didn't have, there were no forts in Europe. The first forts in Europe were invented by, not invented, built by these horse riding nomads who came in the fifth millennium. They came into Europe that way, reintroduced the horse. The horse was like the atomic bomb. If you live in a small village and you live a couple of miles from another small village and you go over and loot their village, they'll come back and loot your village. But if you have a horse and you ride in there and you loot a village and you're 50 miles away, you have a whole different setup. So I think also California Indians lived in relative peace for about 10,000 years, once again, and there were lots of different tribes and languages spoken. So I don't think we're hardwired for war. I think that we're hardwired for defense. Yes, I think we defend ourselves. That's hardwired. But I think organized warfare is possible in the human beings and certainly has happened a lot, but I don't think we're doomed to it. And I wanted to look at societies where we were not doomed to that, where there were other alternatives, and where also the earth was not real estate, but was sacred. Because I think the concept of the earth as real estate that can be owned, bought, and sold was introduced and became, the idea of property in that respect has been excluded a whole lot of people. So, I think right now, given the situation with the climate and with Earth, we need to see it as a sacred trust in many ways. And when I was writing my books, what I did was walk on the Earth and try to feel it as the body. I don't have great religious beliefs. I'm not particularly a goddess worshiper or anything, but the Neolithic people saw the Earth as a goddess because it was something that brought forth life. So it was female and that it gave birth. And so I try to walk on the earth and say, I'm walking on the body of a living thing, male or female, doesn't matter. Don't care what gender it is. I'm walking on the body of a living thing, kind of pretending to myself, imagining. And I could sort of feel it. And I could feel the difference between concrete and earth and leaves. And it was really interesting to think that the earth, it is actually alive beneath us.
Beautiful. That's like American Indians, indigenous, they go, we don't fight fires, we manage fires. So it's right. Just why do you use the word firefighting?
Right. Well, that's because we have cities to defend and, things built on the cities and we can't move aside when the fires come. Yeah,
that's also George Carlin's great line. How can you ever have a civil war?
Right, really, and in civil war, right?
Because
how can we have civilization? No, we do have civilization. I think
a civil means between cities, but more so, civil means acting nice to each other.
I know, yeah.
Kind.
I was just being a smart aleck for you.
How can we keep our governments from going to war?
Good question. When you figure it out, please tell me.
That's a John Cage's great line. That's a very good question. I wouldn't want to ruin it with an answer.
Right. Yeah, and I'm not, by the way, saying we should all go back to living in small Neolithic villages. I mean, that time has come and gone. But I do think it's encouraging to think that human beings lived without war. Probably, if you look at with organized warfare, probably for most of our time on Earth.
Yeah. What was the motive of the cave artists, the cave poets, the cave dancers, the cave music? We only really have the cave art, but there was all those other things going. Your hunch or guess, what was their motive?
Right. Well, I like to think sometimes, or maybe, we probably have 70,000 years behind us of art and dance and song that we don't know. And I think that's a really interesting. Wouldn't it be great if we could somehow be science fiction, be in a time machine and go back and listen to some of that? I'm sorry, I lost the question in my answer.
What was their motive? What was the general motive of the cave artists?
What was the general motive of the cave artist? I've seen some cave art, and I have it in one of my novels, the cave art. I think that it evokes the past. It's a kind of record, but also I think it's a religious look at the animals and people inside the womb of the earth. If you think of the earth as something that brings forth life, and maybe think of it as having a womb, then you can think of the signs and handprints and pictures of the animals, some of which in Europe haven't been in Europe for a very long time, in the European caves and in the petroglyphs in various places, Australia, the Southwest. Those things evoke a kind of memory of not only the past, but a kind of religious memory of the diversity of life and the possibilities of life and a kind of kinship with it. And I think they were probably used for religious rituals, but I can't prove that. But I think that's very possible.
Yeah, you remind me of Captain Beefheart when he came out of the womb. He says, "I'm going back in." And it was like Robin Williams said, "Womb service."
Home service, yes.
So, what's more important, conviction or compromise?
Compromise.
Hey, there's no right or wrong answers, but that one you got right, Mary.
Because you can have conviction. Oh, let's simplify this. Let me just expand on that a little. If you have very strong convictions and you meet somebody who has very strong convictions that are opposite and you argue with them, you will only make them stronger in their convictions that you don't agree with. You cannot argue with people if you want to convince them. The way you can convince people is you try to find common ground. You find ways you can talk to them in ways that are not argumentative. If you argue with people, they will not take $20 bills with you if they get angry. Anger does not make for progress. So what you need is to talk to people and work out compromises that in some ways maybe don't satisfy you, either of you completely, but somehow work it out. And so when I meet people who I have very different convictions from, I always try to find some kind of common ground, some way we can talk to each other as people, something we have in common. And I talk to them about how we have in common. And then I work my way toward talking to them about kinds of things I believe and try to put it in terms that aren't diametrically opposed, in some ways don't do it. Now, obviously, there's some convictions you can't do that with. But in general, that's the way you can really, if you want to convince people and you don't just want to win an argument and be the most powerful, antler clasher on the block, then you have to work toward compromise.
Beautiful. Marcel Duchamp's had a cocktail party and the guy goes, "So what do you do?" And he goes, "I'm a breather." I says, "Hey, I'm a breather too. We have something in common."
Yeah, exactly.
Let's breathe consciously here. So you've accomplished a lot. In your accomplishments, how do you rate these three elements, luck, skill, and ambition? What played the biggest role, second and third?
Well, you have to, I would say in some ways it's got to be luck for number one, because I was lucky to be born in a time and a place and have parents and have a ability and enough, we weren't rich or anything, but we had enough money to have education and background. I mean, I have a family in Indianapolis, Southern Indiana and Kentucky. And the Kentucky family had very little money, but they had enough food. Their whole, I had the luck to sit on the front porch and listen to their oral tales for hours at a time when I was a little kid. They had an oral history. It was like the Begats in the Bible. They knew everybody back to 1742 when they settled that land. And they'd say, "Oh, he chopped up his wife in 4 pieces." And I was a little kid. They didn't censor violence. They never talked about sex. They didn't censor violence. They did, the neighbors, they chopped up their people. No, that was like 1830, or something like that, long man. So I had these wonderful oral tales to hear. I had, not an entirely benevolent childhood, but reasonably benevolent. So that was lucky. I survived my fevers. That was luck. Partly luck that there was penicillin for me. I was able to get an education. I was just born in some ways and for people of a certain social class, not for everybody, but for certain people, a sort of golden time in America when there was the largest middle class, I believe, ever in American history, and we were part of the middle class. So I think luck has to be it. I have to say that if things were different, and I've talked with people, and people have other kinds of luck and other kinds of situations, and they can't do it. So luck, I would say I was lucky, very lucky. What were the others? Skill and ambition. Importance, like now, of what's happening. I would say skill, working on my writing, was important, but ambition was also important. I did want to get out there. I did want to do things, but I didn't have the ambition. Didn't have the ambition to win a Nobel Prize or do that. I just wanted to get published when I was younger. I didn't, I did get published at I think my first, although I won a like second prize in the Atlantic Monthly contest when I was in high school. I wrote a sonnet. I hate sonnets. They're like a bobsled run. Once you get in a sonnet, you can't get out of it because in English hardly anything rhymes. So, but yeah, I'd say skill and ambition. So I had ambition, but if I hadn't had ambition, I wouldn't have done anything. But if I hadn't had skill, I wouldn't have been able to fulfill the ambition. So those two are more even. I'd say luck on the top, and the other two kind of with each other.
Yeah. Mary, thank you so much. I asked for 90 minutes, and I hope we can do a part 2 because we only got through a third of the questions. And I got a couple more
Oh,
here. And then, 3 or 4 months down the line, we could really get into education in your novels. But here's I wanted to tell you the quote I love about luck is Gary Player. The more you practice, the luckier you get.
that's really true. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the better decisions you make about your education and the skills you try to learn, the more likely you are to be more comfortable in life and be able to do what you want to do.
T.S. Eliot said, poetry is outing your inner dialogue. What language is your inner dialogue in?
English. But
What it's
if I pardon me,
it's sort of more metaphorical. What form is your inner consciousness in?
what form is it in? Oh, well, it's in words.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know how to say it. I believe we have an ongoing dialogue all the time. Constantly, we are putting ourselves and seeing the world due to an inner dialogue, which tells us that that's a chair and I'm in a room. And, we have this dialogue going on all the time and it's running through us and we don't pay much attention to us. It's beyond the stream of consciousness. It's what puts us in space and time. And I think the inner dialogue also structures time for me anyway. It structures time, it structures space, it structures everything you do. So there's a constant inner dialogue, which is kind of, you might call it the dialogue of the soul. It's whatever it does that makes us be in reality as we see it. And so that's what I think that my inner thoughts are in that dialogue. My specific inner thoughts about writing come to me generally in an image or in words.
Is perception reality?
A small fragment of reality.
Yeah. So let's close out with this one. And Mary, I hope we can do part 2. This has really been enlightening. I really appreciate it. 2 of my film heroes have this mantra, ignore yourself. Jonas Mekas says, there is no self-expression. And Cecil Taylor, the jazz pianist, says, I'm just a vehicle and this stuff just comes through me. Is art making more self-expression, or you're more a vehicle for whatever technologies, cultures, and environments are dominant?
Well, it's a combination because when you're writing, you can't do anything except express what you've experienced. You can't, that's what you do. But am I a vehicle for which it passes through? I think that's partly the illusion that inspiration, the gods whisper to you, and then you just speak it out loud. And I don't think I'm I'm writing some poems called prophetic poems. I don't, they're not really prophetic poems, but they're done in the voice of Cassandra, who I think is the poster girl for our for our times right now. The woman who Apollo gave the ability to see the future, but nobody would ever believe her, and I think writers sometimes do that too. I wrote a thing in 1986. I wrote a novel called California Burning about out of control wildfires. And the New York publishers actually said, who cares about California? Write about New York. Okay. So this is like one of these early sort of things that people have. So I think that writing, it comes through you, but it's not just self-expression. You're talking to other people. So if you just do self-expression, who cares? You need to, all writing is a dialogue with invisible people.
It's a really great line. Can art making writing be egoless?
No, because there'd be nobody to write. The ego's important. If we're talking egotistical, that's something else. If we're talking narcissistic, that's something else. But you need a sense of self to write. You need a sense of being there. You need to be able to be coherent and, be able to draw on all your education, to draw on everything else. The ego is very important. However, the super ego is very important, and so is the unconscious. If we're going to do the Freudian triad, the unconscious will give you many ideas that will come to you. The superego will help you have some kind of moral compass, and the ego will help you put it into words and communicate.
Wow. I hope we can get into that in part two because, both Krishnamurti and McLuhan said violence is the human search for identity. So it's like amazing, like how do we define ourselves? Like what you just talked about in can art making be egoless? Because some people go, great art is egoless, but it's how we suss out what that word ego means because it carries so much baggage.
Well, I think I like the idea of sprezzatura, which is an Italian idea, which is it makes art look easy. I write to make it look like it was easy to write it. I hide the difficulties of it. I write, and it's the art that conceals art. And I think great art conceals the difficulties and makes it look effortless, so it communicates in a way that is effortless for the reader, so the reader stays with you. And I really like that as a kind of communication. So if you want to, but that's not egoless. That's taking the ego and concealing it in a form that appears to be spontaneous.
Mary, how do you spell that word? That was a beautiful thing you just taught me.
Sprezzatura, I think.
Yeah. Wow. That is such an enlightened comment to teach me. And you've really taught me a lot today, Mary. I so appreciate it. I hope we can book part two somewhere down the line. And I'm going to hit the end broadcast button, but I hope this never ends and we can keep talking forever and ever.
Sure, it would work for me, Jerry.
Okay. Thank you, Mary. Thank you
for
so much.
having me. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.